Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess. This week, Professor David Bosco on freedom of the seas.
I think those three elements that you can't claim the oceans, that everyone has the freedom to navigate and the freedom to exploit ocean resources, that's the core of the Grotian ideal. And then to that, we would add this notion that for there to really be meaningful freedom of the seas, somehow private violence has to be controlled. In a sense, this is one of humanity's first attempts to really grapple with this. You know, you shouldn't just be able to go pull minerals off the deep seabed. You've got to go to the International Seabed Authority, get permission, and then you need to pay some royalties. There certainly is a strong appetite on the part of some countries to just say we get more ocean space in a kind of unilateral way. And that then could produce a really messy outcome where the whole edifice of the UN Convention starts to kind of fall apart.
David Bosco, welcome to Chatter.
Thanks so much. Great to be with you.
I'm going to give you an unusual origin story for this conversation. You don't know this yet because we haven't talked about this part yet.
Okay.
But the reason that I really wanted to talk to you about this is because of a toddler. And this may be the first episode we've had that was spurred by my baby daughter. So when I travel, she likes to now look at a globe and, you know, we show her where I'm going. And I don't think she understands the whole concept, but we're starting. And she points to different countries. Oh, this is Finland or this is Japan, whatever it is. And it was not that long ago, she pointed at this big blue part, which happened to be the Pacific Ocean in this case. Mm-hmm. And she said, what country, because she somehow got the word country from us pointing to these things. She said, what country is that? And I had the quick, immediate answer, which is, don't ask stupid questions, go to your room. No, I said, well, it's not like that. That's not really a country. But it brought me back to the topic that, of course, I've thought about in different contexts for years, but I didn't have a simple answer to a toddler and I was embarrassed. So I need you to give me, an hour's worth of conversation so I can boil it down, which is, why do we have this concept called freedom of the seas and how has it evolved over time and what are the nuances of it? A few years ago, you literally wrote the book on it, the Poseidon Project, the struggle to govern the world's oceans. So when I came out of the blue and asked you if you wanted to do this, that's where it comes from.
Well, I'd like to say right away that your child has expressed more interest in this topic than the three of mine have. So.
Oh no! Oh wow, that's an awkward point. Well, we'll see what we can do. We'll turn them around somehow. How did you? You can go back to when you were a toddler if you'd like, David. But how did you first get interested in digging deep on the concept of freedom of the seas?
Yeah, I think. My background is kind of a mixed academic, journalistic, legal background, and but I think what's always interested me most is kind of global governance questions and laws and power and how they mix. And I'd done a couple of books on like the UN Security Council and the International Criminal Court, and so it was kind of an extension of that in the sense that I wanted to look kind of historically at how our structure for law of the sea developed. And as I got into it, it's the concept of freedom of the seas that jumped out at me as a really interesting one and worth exploring, particularly because, as I was researching this, things were becoming more and more testy in, for example, the South China Sea. Mm-hmm. And the phrase freedom of the seas gets used all the time in that context. And so it seemed like a timely project to inquire about the historical origins of freedom of the seas.
Well, I think you hit the jackpot. It is a great book. And even though it's a few years old, I don't think anything in it has fundamentally changed, especially because you do the full history of it. And I want to talk through some of that history. Yeah. Here today so that everyone can get as smart as I did when I first came across it. But let me hit you with my main takeaway, what I remember from it and reading related things over the years. And you tell me in general where I'm wrong or right.
Okay.
And then we'll dig into the details. So it seems to me that for I don't know, maybe 300-400 years, we've had this doctrine, for lack of a better word, of freedom of the seas that, has earlier roots, certainly, and we'll dig into some of those ancient roots. But the concept itself is often misunderstood, and key elements of it are fading or are already lost. So freedom of the seas doesn't mean now what it did even, 100 years
Yeah.
ago. Tell me what in that general construct sounds truthy to you and what there is probably a little off.
Yeah, no, I think that is, pretty accurate with the overall argument I make. But I mean, one point that's worth emphasizing is that freedom of the seas isn't inevitable or natural.
Hmm.
It's not like foreordained that that was going to be the kind of construct for how to think about the oceans. Here it's worth going back in history a bit to think about when the doctrine really emerged, which was in the early 1600s. Um, and the role of Hugo Grotius here, the kind of Dutch philosopher slash jurist, he was writing in a very specific context, which was that Portugal and Spain were, kind of going about their globe straddling oceanic exploration. And as they were doing that, they wanted to try to avoid, and the Pope wanted to help them avoid stepping on each other's toes too much. And they came up with a construct, the Treaty of Tordesillas, which basically divvied up the world's oceans
Hmm.
between Portugal and Spain. And then when the Dutch wanted to start getting into the Indian Ocean trade, their ships were, often confronted by the Portuguese or by allies of the Portuguese and told, you don't have the right to be in the Indian Ocean because, according to the Treaty of Tordesillas, this belongs to Portugal. So, to the Spanish and the Portuguese at that point, it was kind of natural that they could divvy up the world's oceans and make them, if not quite territory, at least their kind of exclusive zones. And so
Hmm.
it was in that context that Grotius came up with this legal argument about freedom of the seas, um, and put it together in this pamphlet, Mare Liberum, which then gets challenged by others. But it's really at that point that the doctrine emerges as a kind of coherent
Hmm.
one. And over the period of the next couple hundred years, it mostly prevails
Yeah.
in kind of legal and political argumentation and
Yeah.
becomes the kind of backdrop for talking about the oceans.
So I'm envisioning a timeline of human history here, and you're basically putting a pin with Hugo Grotius in what, 1600s
Yeah, early
sometime? Yeah.
1600s. I think 1609 was when he published
And
Mare
that's a key
Liberum.
point, right? Because, in our world, you publish something and people cite it, and that becomes a key point. Of course, the principles he was talking about had been out there through practice
Yes,
and through thought before, but they just hadn't been put together in the way that he did it. So, good
yeah,
on him. But we can go back to, you know, almost everything we end up talking about goes back to the Roman Empire in one way or another. But
right.
even before that, you'd mentioned in the book the Rhodian Sea Law that dates back to centuries earlier. What were the basic concepts of the sea law as we know what was handed down from that time? And then how did things change or not change during the Roman period?
Yeah. I mean, so a lot of those early attempts at creating some kind of governance system for the oceans really had to do more with kind of maritime commerce, and how you'd kind of regulate maritime commerce, and questions that still, bedevil lawyers about, what happens if a shipment doesn't make it on time, or if there's a loss of cargo at sea, and how do you deal with that? How do you deal with maritime violence? So it was really more that was the focal point of some of those early attempts at ocean governance. The question of who owned the oceans, um, I don't think it didn't really come up exactly in those terms, because the idea was so far fetched that you could actually kind of own the
It was a
oceans.
failure of imagination,
Yeah,
right?
exactly, exactly. Now,
But it makes sense if you look at those old maps, David, because you look at a map and the ocean, sometimes it becomes terra incognita. Is
yes,
there's no concept of territoriality as such. It's almost like talking about who owns all of space.
Right. Well,
You
and
know,
that's an important point. It's really not, of course, until the 1400s, 1500s that we get a real understanding of how the oceans all fit together. So there was just a lot of lack of understanding about the nature of the oceans. But the Roman point is a good one, and it's worth thinking about that for a sec, because the Romans, particularly when you talk about the Romans in the Mediterranean,
mm,
they actually did have, in essence, an ability to control that.
yeah,
And so there was, and I cite some of this in the book, and obviously here, standing on the shoulders of much more learned people who've tried to look at Roman jurisprudence, there was kind of a debate about, did Rome own the Mediterranean Sea?
mm,
And I didn't find in my review of the literature that there was any kind of conclusive statement about that. But when Roman territory surrounded essentially the Mediterranean, you can think about the concept of ownership of the oceans in a much more concrete sense. Um, but I think it's really not till we get kind of global oceanic exploration and maritime capacity
yeah.
has really become much more proficient, that we get this question presented of, can a sovereign own the oceans?
I find the Roman example, like it is in so many cases, interesting because we have enough sources to know some of the debates and some of the conversations. And it was a system that has enough parallels to our own modern times that we can see what they did and is there anything to learn from it. The Mediterranean is such an interesting example because my very limited sense of Roman history is, there were these episodic issues with piracy.
Yeah.
Julius Caesar famously seized by pirates at one point. And yet they did see it as their enforcement right, I think, and almost their
Yes.
enforcement duty, successively sending commanders to wipe out pirates, so that this sea could continue to be free for Romans primarily to do what they needed to do. And so in that sense, the Mediterranean was more like a large lake than like
Hmm.
an extension of the Atlantic Ocean.
Hmm.
And yet, if you go back through ancient history, I can't find too many cases where any substantial political entity said that a lake within their jurisdiction was open waters internationally and nobody could own it. Lakes
Right.
clearly are property. And then big lakes, unless they happen to be along a border between what we now would call states or international entities, the big lakes are the same. And then you get to the size of the Mediterranean. Once an entity like the Roman Empire controls it,
Hmm.
I can see the mental model saying, well, this is more like a lake than like
Hmm.
that big thing beyond the Pillars of Hercules. So we're going to apply the same concepts we've applied to these lakes we have in Italy to this much bigger lake that we now control. So it
Yeah.
seems to make sense, right?
Yeah, it does. I mean, the logic of it is there, and as you said, the Romans certainly saw it as their right, and as you put it, their obligation to kind of police the Mediterranean. Um, Now that does raise an interesting point as we talk about freedom of the seas, um, which is, in a lot of ways, freedom of the seas is a doctrine that can be respected most by inaction, by kind of not interfering with the right of others to use the ocean, right?
Mm,
But if
yeah,
we when we start talking about maritime violence and suppressing maritime violence,
yeah.
you're then talking about action that has to be taken.
Mm,
But of course, once an actor has the wherewithal to take that action, they then have the ability and perhaps the motive to try to control that space in even broader sense than repressing violence, to actually exercise kind of territorial control. So there's a bit of a tension between what you could call the negative aspects of freedom of the seas, which is kind of let others do what they want on the oceans, and the positive, which is
right.
that actors need to take steps to suppress maritime violence.
Yeah. The other world system, I don't know what else to call it, but the other example we have that we have much less knowledge of just because of the lack of written recorded knowledge is the Polynesian system, which
Yes.
not at the same time, but a little later, you had seafarers crossing hundreds, thousands of miles of the Pacific Ocean. And there's no account that I've found, and we've talked on this podcast to people on the literature and art side of
Uh-huh.
Polynesian experiences and others, but I haven't seen anything where there was a private claim or a state or a king who basically said, yeah, the ocean's all ours.
Right.
Even if they would sail to another island and consider that part of their control or part of their political unity in some way or another, it never seemed like the ocean, the wide open ocean, was treated in that way, even by a culture that was very, very reliant upon and obsessed with everything about the ocean.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I certainly didn't find anything like that in my research.
Yeah,
I mean, some of those Polynesian voyages were just absolutely staggering in
right.
terms of how far they went, and but I agree. I don't see any kind of political claim or legal claim there to ocean space.
Hmm. So from the Roman times and Polynesians, again, very much a separate world system for so long, but the through the Grotian ideal that he wrote about, we get to these main concepts of when you say freedom of the seas, what do you mean? And I think most people get this, but thinking about it means, okay, then we talk about how do you actually govern these, which is I think what we'll talk about most of our time here.
Yeah.
One of those is just not claiming open ocean, that generally political entities can't say, yeah, that area, 3 days sail that direction with no land within sight. That's part of our territory. You just don't claim open ocean. The
Right.
second one is that, and perhaps as a corollary of that, that vessels do and should have unimpeded access to those spaces, that there aren't walls being put up or specific lanes. And then third is, especially in the more modern times, maybe it was assumed in older times, that there's a freedom to fish, to exploit the water, and you don't have to appeal to some sovereign to go fishing in the open ocean.
Hmm.
Does that characterize most of that freedom of the seas ideal in broad strokes until we get into details of law?
Yeah, I think that does. I think those three elements, that you can't claim the oceans, that everyone has the freedom to navigate, and the freedom to exploit ocean resources, that's the
Mm,
core of the Grotian ideal. And then
mm,
to that, we would add this notion that somehow private, for there to really be meaningful freedom of the seas, somehow private violence has to be
mhm.
controlled. I think that would be the only thing that I would kind of add to that.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense to me, right? It does have truthiness at this point because the idea of controlling territory, it doesn't mean that you have a fort or a customs post every 6 feet in order to control the 6 feet from that to the next post.
Hmm.
But it means a semblance of, you are the authority for some kind of governance structure, for some kind of economic or tax structure, that there aren't competing senses of loyalty unless it's a feudal system where it is vertical
Hmm.
and encapsulating in its size and scope. And you can't do that on the open ocean. You can't, unless you literally have thousands of ships in an area that can see each other. Very hard until modern times to have any sense of control of a water space beyond the eyesight of the shore.
Yes, and that was what a lot of what Grotius relied on in his pamphlet. And one of the notable aspects of Grotius's writing is that he didn't rely heavily, for example, as many publicists would at the time, on scripture.
Hmm.
He certainly had, there were some references to scripture, but he really relies more heavily on what we would term natural law, kind of thinking about the nature of the oceans, and
Hmm.
why, if you think about the nature of the oceans, it leads you kind of ineluctably to the idea that freedom of the seas is the natural framework. Because just
Hmm.
as you said, the oceans are so vast, the oceans are fluid, and so it's very hard to demarcate lines as you could on land, and so that nature leads us to the idea of freedom of the seas. And in the same way, the oceans are, from Grotius's perspective, a natural highway between societies. And here he
Hmm.
does talk about a kind of providential uh, perspective, that they seem as if they were put there by God to help us move between different societies and civilizations. Um, the other point that Grotius made um, is that the resources of the oceans seem so vast that there wasn't the need for control in the way that you might have on land in order to control the use of resources.
Right.
Because to Grotius, it seemed like absurd that you could ever exhaust the fisheries of the oceans. And so,
Hmm.
why do we need to, divide them up and have border lines and, in the way we do on land?
Well, that's his failure of
Yeah,
imagination,
yeah, that
as we've
was.
learned
That
in
was.
modern times, but understandable
Yeah,
based
totally
on
understandable.
the experience at that point. One thing I remember from when I was a kid, and I don't remember how old, but probably reading something in National Geographic or some book about a 3 mile limit
Hmm.
around a country's shoreline. And I didn't understand why that was, but that stuck in my head that that's one of those numbers
Yeah.
you should remember, like, how many feet are in a mile in the US system, right? Or, 3.14159. Got that one stuck here forever. Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. But the 3 mile territorial limit, and I've heard that referred to as the cannon shot rule. And that's an interesting name for it because it definitely places it in a very specific time for when the
Yes.
concept came up, and why it's not the slingshot rule, or why it's not the bow and arrow rule, or why it's not the long range artillery rule, but it is the cannon shot rule. Talk a little bit about how that developed and why that was persistent for so long, even as technology did change.
Yeah, and it was, and it really does go back. I mean, even Grotius himself, the critical exponent of the idea of freedom of the seas, he acknowledged that very close to the shore, it was reasonable for a sovereign to be able to control kind of a band of ocean very close to the shore. So Grotius conceded that, and then some of the thinkers following in the wake, kind of refined this into the cannon shot rule. And I think there was another Dutch thinker named Binkershock who I think was kind of the most uh, famous in kind of outlining that 3 mile rule, that cannon shot rule, and that becomes widely accepted. But you can see here the logic is land based, right? That if a cannon can reach three
Right,
miles
right.
out into the sea, that's how far the sovereign can control. So I would say by the time we get to the middle of the 1700s or so, if you look at kind of the leading texts in international law that existed at that point, that this idea was pretty well established. That yeah, the oceans are open, shouldn't be claimed, but you do get this kind of 3 mile band that can be controlled from
Hmm.
land. And this is an important point, though, actually, that's
Uh-huh.
worth emphasizing, is we have to remember when we're talking about this period, we're really before the era of multilateral treaties for the most part. So when we think of international law at that point, we're really thinking about the kind of writings of publicists and kind of the most
Yeah.
accepted experts, and there is no kind of big multilateral treaty system.
That's a fair point, is we project backwards a bit to talk about what the international system was and what it allowed and what it didn't, but a lot of it was just practice of
Yes,
individual entities, and we have to probably remember not to put more onto it than what it was.
right, right.
Yeah. So in this case, you've got these doctrines that are out there that people seem to accept almost by default, right? Because nobody has challenged them and had enough power to change them. That is just, I guess, the natural way of doing things. That people can go out and go on the seas. Sometimes they're on the behest of government. Sometimes they're just people making a living, getting fish and trading. But you do end up getting an interesting concept, probably in older times too. But it becomes really well known in more modern times, and that's the use of privateers,
Yeah,
which raises some interesting questions in the current international law context. But at the time, there really wasn't any governance for things like this. But talk about the whole concept. What is a privateer? It was immensely important for a major period of, emerging European history, global exploration and conflict, but it's something that I think we lose sight of now because we do have such different governance structures.
Hmm.
So what was privateering and how did that affect these concepts?
Yeah, privateering was the idea that, in times of war, a sovereign may want to give private ship owners, private captains, the ability to essentially kind of conduct violence on behalf of the state with the authorization of the state. And so, you'd have captains, vessels that would get a letter essentially from the sovereign saying, I give you the authority to go out and harass, Spanish shipping or harass the French or what have you. And they could then do so feeling like they'd been kind of duly authorized. The problem, of course, was that once people became proficient at this, and whatever underlying conflict that produced the authorization had then maybe dissipated, these people often then found that they were good at this and therefore they were going to continue doing it without authorization. And
Right.
so there became this kind of cycle of pirates becoming privateers and then back to pirates, or privateering just kind of producing new pirates. And it was realized that the overall system was it was producing too much of this private violence on the oceans, and so you get a kind of move away from privateering and a kind of slow but overall quite effective crackdown on private violence, with the British, of course, playing a very important role. I mean, the other story that's kind of embedded here is the rise to primacy of the British
Mm.
as a maritime force, and that's something worth thinking through a little bit, because the British were not naturally Grotian in some ways. They, it was the Dutch, of course, that had produced Grotius and had produced the idea of freedom of the seas, and there were some English publicists who really pushed back on that idea,
Mm.
because England liked the idea of being able to say the English Channel is ours, or other big chunks of nearby waters are ours. And so it takes time as the British kind of rise to maritime supremacy for them to actually become champions of freedom of the seas. And they never fully become champions, but my argument is that by the time we get into kind of the late 1800s, they have in important ways become champions of the Grecian system.
Yeah, that is interesting because they have on the one hand, the British developed a naval system that could have allowed them to essentially argue for extended
Yes,
territorial waters because
yes,
they had the power to enforce their own, but also they could have used allies with internationally recognized expanded waters to crack down on some of the piracy that was annoying the British fleet and one of the few scourges to them. But then overall, I think strategically, you had British leaders who realized, wait a minute, though, freedom of the seas, when we are the greatest naval power, probably a good thing for us despite those minor headaches.
yes. And this is an important point that I try to hammer out a bit in the book, is that there's a strategic logic to freedom of the seas for
Mhm.
the leading maritime power. And the really interesting historical moment here is, you know, in the early 1800s, as the British are vanquishing Napoleon, and they really are now kind of unchallenged in terms of their maritime
Mhm.
dominance. And as you said, they could have used that moment to say, okay, now we are going to craft a treaty of Tordesillas for our time, and we're going to say vast swaths of the ocean are ours. And instead, they do the exact opposite, which is to actually pull back from some of the maritime claims they had historically made. And that's a really striking moment. So, Britain, instead of trying to claim, using its power to claim more of the oceans, actually pulls back from the claims that it's already made and says, okay,
Mm.
the English Channel isn't ours, actually. And this
Yeah.
area of the North Sea or whatever is not ours. And so at that point, they start to assume this role of protector of ocean freedom and firm opponent of any other sovereign claiming chunks of the ocean.
Yeah.
And so that's an important point. Now, having said that, there's a fly in the ointment here. I've never really known how to use that expression, but I think I'll try it there. Here, from the standpoint of whether the British are really advocates of ocean freedom, because even during this time when they are retreating from some of their ocean claims,
Mhm.
they still believe in a very expansive right for British ships to board other vessels and to kind of interfere with shipping, certainly during conflict, even neutral vessels. And this is a persistent point of friction in the 17s, 1800s. And so the British are never kind of, I would say, 100% Grotian. But they have come a long way, certainly, in terms of being an opponent of sovereign claims to ocean space.
And overall, it did have a horrible effect on some populations because of the policies and colonialization. It did have a positive benefit for a lot of people in terms of the opening up of trade and that how that worked out. But from a British perspective,
Hmm.
there are cases of them debating these points and trying to figure out
Yes.
what is in our interest, what is the best policy for us because we have the power to enforce it in many ways. Um, but it's fun to watch the kind of the trade-off between short-term interest and long-term
Hmm.
enlightened self-interest for the long term that plays out in British policy when it comes to the seas.
Yes.
Now, one part of this that we haven't really talked about yet is safety on the seas,
Yeah.
because as long as people have been going out on the water, there have been problems. We tend to think of shipwrecks as isolated things, but they're not. Shipwrecks are just everywhere.
Yeah.
Literally millions of shipwrecks around the world's oceans, lakes and bays, etc. And in ancient times, it was just considered a cost of doing business.
Hmm.
Whether it was the Romans trying to learn how to do the whole fleet thing at first, the Mongols going to Japan, the Chinese, anything. You just find the Spanish and Portuguese just, you know what, it sucks, but we're going to lose some big ships and a lot of stuff with them.
Hmm.
But things really started to change, I think. And I think it tends to be when international communication started growing. So the mid 19th century, when people were actually communicating and learning more and knowing what happened and how it happened, matched up with the technology to do something about it.
Hmm.
Communicate better between ships, to arrange in advance what you're going to do in certain cases. But I didn't key it to something that you did, which is there was one major ship incident in 1853 or 1854, I think, which was the Arctic Vesta crash off of Newfoundland. And you point to that leading to the next several decades of people getting together internationally
Yeah.
and talking about maritime safety, leading to conferences and agreements. And I'd like you to talk through that process because it's so interesting that for millennia of human history, safety concerns were known and people just shrugged their shoulders. And then suddenly, for some reason, they decide we collectively can get together and do something about this. So let's sit down and start, in a sense, binding our own freedom by letting us make some simple compromises to ensure safety for everyone.
Hmm. Yeah, and a lot of this, I mean, there was a real kind of public fascination with, um, incidents like this at sea, and they were getting kind of new attention in the media, and it was really being raised in the public consciousness. There was also a lot of emphasis on, the seaworthiness of vessels, and there was a campaigner in Britain, Samuel Plimsoll, who really made a very public campaign about seaworthiness problems. And so this does start to manifest itself at the international level, and you get some of these early multilateral conferences to try to deal with this. I mean, none of this was, you talk about kind of tying your own hands, and it was a very limited, commitments in a legal sense that countries were making. It was really more a kind of sharing of best practices for kind of what we can do on the oceans.
Okay.
And But it is a sign that we are moving into that period of history when it's becoming much more normal that you will get countries together to sit down and talk about some of these issues, and that, of
Mhm.
course, becomes very important. Now, they weren't talking about the big kind of political sovereignty questions.
Mm.
They were talking about things like, foghorns and kind of,
Right.
safety of navigation and how far away vessels should be from each other and what the obligation is to help
Mm.
a distressed vessel at sea. But it does signal that we are moving into that new era of multilateral conferences, which becomes so important then later.
Hmm. And it also comes at a time when, I mean, I'm no expert on this, but I understand that humans have dug canals for a long, long time between, rivers and other areas, small bodies of water. But it's only in this era that you start getting the massive projects, the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal. And there's no reason that these had to be open to all commercial vessels. That's
Right.
how it happened to be, right? I think the Suez Canal was written, the agreement was written that way from the beginning, that it would be
Hmm.
open to all commercial vessels at all times. But it need not have been that way. It could have very much been we put in the capital and the resources to build this canal. Damn it, it's our territory, and anybody coming through it
Hmm.
has to, at a minimum, pay a toll. But we might not even let them through just out of spite. How do you think that evolved as a norm, that these large canals connecting, saving thousands of miles of voyage time? Um, how do you think that evolved, and how important is that concept that even something like the Suez Canal linking bodies of water is wrapped up in this freedom of the seas mentality?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing to say, I think, is that, and this is the reason I argue that historically speaking, the fullest flowering of freedom of the seas should be this thought of as this period of kind of the late 1800s up until the outbreak of the First World War. But the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, what's critically important, I think, is that those facilitated ocean commerce in huge ways, and really, allowed a flowering of ocean commerce. And you see the numbers in terms of, tons of, goods transported by sea and everything jumped during this period. So that's, I think, the first point. You raise a really interesting question about the kind of norm that these passageways should be open to all. It was never, I think, seen as legally required necessarily that passage through these canals would be unimpeded. But I think you're right that it was very much the norm, that at least for commercial vessels, they were going to be, permitted to go through these passages, and that fit into the broader logic, which was that freedom of commerce is kind of to everyone's benefit, and we should try to maintain that. But of course, at various points, access to these canals does become obstructed in various ways. And as we get into the more modern era, the status of the canals is interesting in that they really don't fall under the law of the sea, because they are on the sovereign territory of, Panama or Egypt. And so
Yeah.
they actually are somewhat to the side when it comes to the law of the sea.
What about the other thing that isn't technically right? Because when you think of the seas, you're thinking of ships, sailing along, riding the waves. maybe doing some fishing that, at least for most of human history, has gone down a few meters or tens of meters. But you're not thinking of the deep trenches. You're not thinking of the deep sea floor for almost this entire time that we've covered so far. But suddenly, in the last, especially, 100, years, oh, wow, suddenly you've got things like laying down undersea cables
Yes.
and mineral resources that can be accessed through technology. Let's start with the cables first, because this is now, of course, a big issue with the vulnerability of undersea cables and the internet infrastructure, among other things. How did undersea cables first come about? And to the best of your, ability to research it, did you find that people were suddenly questioning the territoriality, or was it just, hey, the ocean's free, we can lay cable wherever the hell we want?
Yeah, I mean, it was really more the latter, but it's
Yeah.
in the, the mid 1800s, that this really becomes an issue, and you get the first attempts to lay cable, between, North America and the UK, and it was really interesting reading about the history of this because the first couple attempts failed. And there was even accusations that, the whole thing had been kind of a swindle, and that, because some investors got burned when they put funds into this. But finally, of course, you do have the success of the laying of these early cables, and it is striking reading those histories how it was pretty much taken for granted that countries had the right to do this. So there were certainly questions about, how can we ensure that these cables are functioning, and how do we y- how do we try to prevent accidental damage to them? But there was never any felt need to make the legal case for why you had the right to lay the cables. And so
Hmm.
I think this
Hmm.
just kind of shows the way that a kind of basic doctrine of freedom of the seas is operating in the background here. That, yeah, in a freedom of the seas environment, you have the right to lay these cables.
Because there's no parallel right on land. It's not, well, it'd be convenient for me for communicating with a colony or a non-contiguous part of territory to, lay down something through your territory. But
Right.
the seas make that work because the concept is nobody owns that area.
Yeah, exactly. But the other point you raised is a good one, which is that at around this same time,
Hmm.
there was starting simply to be a greater understanding of what the seafloor was like.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
through the use of soundings and other mechanisms, it was starting to be understood that the seafloor was very irregular,
Hmm.
which is an important point. But also that the seafloor might contain some very interesting resources. Now
Hmm.
we're a ways away here, of course, from the idea of seabed mining, but you did have some of these British oceanographic expeditions, which started to do kind of dredging of the deep seabed. And they
Hmm.
started to find, for example, these kind of odd lumps of material that they would pull up, which we would now know as kind of polymetallic nodules.
Hmm.
And so, knowledge of the undersea world is starting to expand, and we're getting some glimmerings of some important resources that might be on the ocean floor.
A few minutes ago, you referred to, this, I don't know what you call it, the golden age of
Yeah, yeah.
ocean governance, right? From
Or the
the
ocean, the
mid
golden age of
19th
freedom of the
century.
seas, at least.
Yeah, good point. And you ended that around World War One. Now, my limited understanding is that World War One and the seas had one dramatic change and several smaller ones. The dramatic one being submarines and the fact
Right.
that nothing at sea was really safe, as the Germans showed. But what I don't know, and I'm curious for your thoughts on, is whether submarines were a cause of the unraveling of this freedom of the seas concept, or were they an effect of the other technologies and changes, and submarines just kind of went naturally into this idea that the times they are a changing.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps the biggest change here is that with World War One, you're obviously having kind of industrialized warfare on a scale that hadn't been seen,
Hmm.
and you are getting major powers with the capacity, with an increased capacity to interfere with ocean commerce. And submarines, I would say, then are one important vehicle, not
Yeah.
the only one, but one important vehicle for that ability to interfere with ocean commerce. And so, what you see during World War One then is some of the most audacious attempts to essentially block off areas of the
Yeah.
oceans, with the British, of course, wanting to kind of keep Germany penned in. And it's and to underline the point that it's not just about submarines. One of the attempts to do this was the laying of a enormous barrage of what they called a barrage of mines, of
Hmm.
sea mines, which would try to keep the Germans penned in. And the Americans actually got very involved in that when they were entered the war. And so we have interference with ocean commerce that is way beyond anything that we'd seen before, and that gets, of course, gets replicated in World War II through a variety of mechanisms. But certainly, submarines and unrestricted submarine warfare, the idea that submarines could simply target any commercial vessel that might be in any way providing supplies to its enemies, that was new, and and that, I think, is an important limitation and an important pushback on the idea of ocean freedom.
Right. So going back to those principles we talked about earlier, right? One of those was, the open ocean is not claimed. Well, technically, the UK didn't claim the North Sea and the passage out of the Skagerrak so that the
Hmm.
German fleet was bought, but they kind of did, and they had enough ships that they could really enforce it. And I believe they even put some mines or chains down in some areas. Certainly, the idea that vessels have unimpeded access went out the window pretty quickly.
And
Um,
there had always been, of course, during conflict, interference with
mhm.
shipping. So I'm not trying to say that this
Right.
was something totally new, but the scale of it was
Yeah.
was so far beyond what had been attempted in the past.
And so that does really point to the technology then, because the technology enabled
Yes.
these activities, both the British surface activities and the German sub activities. But yeah, I mean, you talk about the unraveling of the concept from this point basically forward with ebbs and flows. But the ideas of freedom of the seas have taken a battering in the last 100 plus years. What other ways has this manifested itself?
Right. So one area is on the military front, the clear, legacy of World War One and World War Two, that in any time of conflict of a sufficient severity, there is going to be massive interference with ocean commerce. That's, I think, kind of the legal legacy of World War One and World War Two. Um, but the other thing, of course, that's happening is another pillar of freedom of the seas, which is freedom to exploit the resources of the oceans, is starting to crumble. And that comes, I would say, most clearly in the whaling context, even in a sense, whaling before fishing, because whaling fleets were becoming so much more proficient
Right.
in, say, the 1920s and 1930s, again, because of technologies, slipways and kind of different types
Mhm.
of harpoons, with grenades that were just becoming much, much more deadly with whale populations, that you get the realization that, wow, if we don't regulate this somehow, we are going to totally exhaust this resource. And so you get some of these early attempts, not necessarily very effective, but early attempts to try to regulate use of the ocean resources. And that's happening to some degree also in the fisheries area.
Mhm.
And so that is basically putting pressure on this pillar of the Grotian idea that we should have the freedom to exploit resources, right?
Yeah.
So on the one hand, we have massive new enclosures and disruption of ocean commerce in the military level, and then we get this pressure on the Grotian idea of freedom to exploit ocean resources, and so that starts to put great pressure on the Grecian framework.
Hmm.
And then, and here we would move, I think, right to the days after World War II. You get a real breakdown in the other pillar, which is
Hmm.
that ocean space shouldn't be claimed.
Right. I did not realize that a lot of that is due to United States policy starting in 1945 with Harry Truman, right?
Yeah, so it's an interesting kind of irony, given the U.S. position as a kind of the defender of ocean freedom, defender of freedom of the seas, that it really was the Truman administration that kind of opened the Pandora's box here. And what was going on was that there was a contest within the Truman administration in the closing days of World War II about the continental shelf and the potential oil and gas resources that might
Hmm.
be there. And there were, within the Interior Department, there was a lot of pressure to say this is our space,
Hmm.
and that the continental shelf, we can use that and we can claim those oil resources. And you've got the State Department then saying, wait a minute, is this a good idea? We've always been kind of opposed to countries claiming ocean space, but ultimately it's the domestic imperative, the resource imperative that wins out. And the Truman administration issues these proclamations, one about the continental shelf,
Hmm.
essentially saying we own the resources of the continental shelf. And it's important to note that this is pretty much done unilaterally. There's a little bit of consultation with a couple of close allies, but it's mostly done unilaterally. And at the same time, there's another proclamation about fisheries, which is a little bit more ambiguous, but basically says the US has a special right to, manage fisheries even beyond 3 miles. So, and of course, other countries pick up on this. And other countries start replicating this by claiming their own continental shelf. But as should have been anticipated by the US, plenty of countries say, okay, fine, then, if we're going to start doing this unilaterally, we'll just claim a 200-mile territorial sea.
Right.
Right. To which the United States immediately responded, no, 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 that's not what we were trying to do here. And, the US could make the point that it's different to claim the continental shelf and the resources of the continental shelf than it is to claim that you control the waters out to 200 miles. And there is a difference there. But the US kind of started this process with, its unilateral declarations. And so by the time we get into the late 1940s, 1950s, you've got countries making lots of different claims. And
Hmm.
the 3 mile rule, which had been fairly well established, is really kind of blown apart.
Yeah, I love the Pandora's box idea here because that really does, there's so much chaos after this.
Yeah,
And it's not unidirectional, right? Because yes, you do have the conflicts, the claims, the continental shelves, you have the UK and Iceland literally resorting to violence, not
right.
major conflict, but low intensity conflict, I would call it, in the so-called Cod Wars. But on the flip side, by the late 1950s, you have people meeting and talking, the Convention on the High Seas, and people trying to come up with ways of saying, okay, yeah, things are unraveling from this consensus that some of us didn't even consciously realize we had, but we can also get together like we are in so many other areas, from civil aviation to international communications,
Yeah.
and we can get together and create something eventually leading to the law of the sea, which I always thought sounded so grandiose and wonderful. And then when you dig into it, you realize, oh, but wait, number one, it's hundreds of pages of technicalities, but also uh, some countries don't participate in this.
Right.
So talk through that, like how you have this unraveling, but at the same time, you have enlightened leaders and selfish ones coming together to say, how can we create an international legal structure that best suits our interests and sets up the commons?
Yeah. And you do have this period of several decades of real, intermittent attempts to deal with kind of the legal chaos of different countries claiming different things in terms of how much ocean space they owned. But one important dynamic, and you kind of alluded to this already, is that obviously we're in a period of massive change in the international system, and specifically with decolonization, which is happening at this point in the late 50s into the 60s. And you've got kind of new players on the international stage who are becoming part of these international deliberations, which had to that point been mostly the province of the Western countries. One of the interesting dynamics is that a lot of these new countries are highly skeptical of freedom of the seas as a doctrine because they think of it, number one, as a doctrine that was kind of created by European powers and that they weren't involved in.
Sure.
They also, fairly or unfairly, and I think historically here it's not necessarily so easy to make this connection, but they see it as kind of linked to colonialism. That, freedom of the seas was a doctrine that allowed for colonialism and the
Mhm.
extension of colonial control. And so as these deliberations continue, when you have, US diplomats trying to argue about the value of freedom of the seas, they start to get a very skeptical reception from many of these countries in Africa, Asia, parts of the Middle East, who say, why should we be beholden to this Grotian view? Um, and but it is a very long process of trying to come up with some kind of framework that will respond to both the interests of maritime powers, but also the interests of countries that might have extensive coastlines but are not maritime powers and don't really have global aspirations. And how do you
Right.
do that? An important change that happens in this period is, of course, we're in the period of the Cold War. The Soviet perspective on ocean issues starts to change. And the Soviets, particularly as we get into the 1960s, are becoming a global maritime power in a way that they hadn't been previously. And that makes them, in a funny way, more comfortable with the US position with the US position on kind of the importance of freedom of the seas.
Hmm.
And so the US and the Soviets start to have some important commonalities there. And that is an important step for moving toward what eventually then becomes the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
If you could, and I realize this is an unfair question because it's asking you to do nearly the impossible, but because you're a superhero, I expect more of you. Um, could you describe for people who pay no attention
Yeah.
to international governance and maritime issues, what are the few core concepts of the conventions that have been adopted since the 1950s and even of the law of the sea, which is not universally recognized? But
Right.
what are some of those core concepts that govern, what can a country do? How far out from its
Right.
territory? What are those changes from the theory that we've talked about already?
So there are a couple key elements that emerge, and in no particular order. So the first thing that, one of the first things that happens is that the Truman Proclamation, the idea that countries own kind of the continental shelf or the resources of the continental shelf, which had been put forward unilaterally by the United States, that becomes pretty quickly accepted. And that's an important point because it's a reminder that unilateralism can sometimes quite quickly produce multilateral results. And so this idea becomes accepted that out to about 200 miles, countries can claim the resources of the continental shelf. So that's number one. Then another key pillar that emerges is that the territorial sea, right? We had talked about historically the 3 mile territorial sea that
Yes.
needs to be expanded.
Hmm.
So that gets expanded out to 12 miles. So we've now quadrupled the size of the territorial sea. But probably the most important element of this grand compromise about the oceans is a recognition that coastal countries have an important say in the economic uses of the ocean way beyond 12 miles.
Mm,
And this is then the innovation of the exclusive economic zone.
mm,
And the exclusive economic zone then goes out to 200 miles, and that says that the coastal country controls fishing, controls other economic uses of the waters out to that point. Um, Another important element, and here is where the US and the Soviets were really quite insistent, was that we need to have a special set of rules for international straits. So those kind of naturally occurring narrow strips of water that connect bigger bodies of water. So obviously the Strait of Gibraltar or the Strait of Hormuz being kind of classic examples.
mhm.
Those need to have a special set of rules so that they don't just become the territorial seas of whatever countries are abut the strait, but that we're gonna protect international right to pass through those straits, and that gets worked then into the convention. And going back to the strategic logic here, for both the U.S. and the Soviets, it was critical that their navies and their naval forces be able to pass through these straits without having to worry about the the countries abutting the strait having some kind of objection to that. So I would
Mhm.
say those were kind of the key elements of
Yeah.
the Law of the Sea Convention. But there were plenty, and we can get into this, of course, there are plenty of ambiguities
Yeah,
built into that.
I would say so. And whether it's ambiguities or things completely left undone or just natural consequences of choices that were made,
Hmm.
a lot of the conflicts people do read about. So people who don't pay attention to international governance in general, maritime law and cooperation specifically, they still hit these. And I'm thinking of things like piracy.
Yeah.
You'll still hear about the Somali pirates, and you'll watch the movie made about, what was it, Captain
Captain
Phillips
Phillips.
and
Yep. Yep.
the story there. Um, you might hear about U.S. and Canada, who otherwise get along pretty well historically, given the long border, having real issues over the Northwest Passage.
Yes.
Or you might hear about China declaring itself a near Arctic state and suddenly sending ships up in the northern route that Russia claims in many cases as internal waters. You might even hear about these things that have the great acronym, the FONOPS, the Freedom of Navigation Operations, where the U.S. Navy, among others, but mostly the U.S. Navy,
Yeah.
will go sailing between China and Taiwan just to show, yes, these are international waters. And just like, defending a copyright, you got to show that they're international waters. So I think, not to mention, right, fights over small islands that are basically just rocky outcroppings. People still hit these things. And all of those issues I just mentioned, I think, have a lot going on in terms of the conventions, the law, the
Yes.
governance, interpretations, and you can't really understand modern conflict. You can't understand the emerging interests of China and its flexing its muscle in various areas um, without understanding some of these maritime issues.
Yeah. And the other thing that, if I could go back and just add one element to what
Yeah.
came out of what becomes the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and kind of the central elements of the framework today, there's a real emphasis placed on international governance of some ocean spaces. And this is something that we're still very much working out and is still quite fragile. But the way that the UN Convention really provides for this is that the convention says there should be international governance of the deep seabed, specifically when it comes to seabed mining. And what was created through the convention was the International Seabed Authority, which is a very interesting international organization based in Jamaica. And they are supposed to have responsibility for managing any mining of the deep seabed. And by the deep seabed, I'm talking about seabed beyond the 200-mile continental shelf, beyond any kind of national claims. How do we, mine that area if we are going to do that? So this raises another important element here, which is a lot of the history of the law of the sea is about kind of freedom of the seas versus national control. And there's this kind of push and pull between, how much your nation's going to control and how much is going to be the domain of freedom of the seas. But now we get another concept, which is, should we have international control of ocean space, and what should that look like? And again, the seabed is where that is most elaborated, but you're also getting a lot of mechanisms emerging for management of fisheries on the high seas. So having what they call regional fisheries management organizations, groups of countries getting together and saying, hey, on this part of the high seas, we are going to try to manage fishing in such a way that stocks get, exploited but not exhausted. And so that's another important element to think about when we think about the modern structure for ocean governance.
And it also opens up some parallels that I know very smart people are working on, and I'm glad they are, but I can't follow all of them. But in those ways you've just mentioned, there deep ocean beds have a similarity to space,
Mm-hmm.
to Antarctica,
Yeah.
to even cyber, in terms of these spaces that just aren't like the way we've traditionally handled territoriality.
Yep.
They're different in some way. And to the extent there are lessons that can be learned from applying one to the other, or saying, well, at least let's do a thought experiment of, if the Antarctic Treaty, really starts to go downhill, what can it learn from ocean governance? Or what can ocean governance learn from some of the space treaties? And
Yeah.
increasingly, what are we going to do about the moon, which has some ambiguity? And what can we learn from ocean? So all of these probably could benefit from people talking across their silos that work on each.
Absolutely. And it's really going to be fascinating to watch what happens with the International Seabed Authority,
Hmm.
because in a sense, this is one of humanity's first attempts to really grapple with this. And the basic idea is there should be international regulation. So there should be, you shouldn't just be able to go pull minerals off the deep seabed. You've got to go to the International Seabed
Hmm.
Authority, get permission, and then you need to pay some royalties into the system, which then should go kind of for the benefit of everybody. So it's a really kind of interesting novel structure that has been created, but it's really only in the last couple years that this structure is starting to move toward operationalization,
Hmm.
because it's just not been financially economically viable. It's
Yeah.
a hard thing to do to pull these minerals off the deep seabed. A couple of companies are now seem to be getting close enough that you're getting these questions raised at the ISA about, okay, what should the precise regulations be about how you do this? And then,
Hmm.
okay, how much do countries need to pay in royalties if they're pulling minerals off of the seabed? And so it's going to be fascinating to watch what happens at the ISA over the coming years.
I'm getting into the habit of asking you unfair questions, and I like it. So I'm going to keep doing it here. So, taking all this into account, you've looked at the long history, you're following some of the activities going on now. In general terms, are you a pessimist or an optimist about ocean governance? Let's say over the next 25 or even 50 years, have we learned enough, and are there enough common interests that people will continue to advance and make some progress? Or do you think that more unraveling of common norms is unfortunately just as likely?
Right. That is a tough question. I guess I tend toward the optimistic vision, that we are going to end up with some kind of semi-effective international mechanisms for trying to manage ocean space, particularly when it comes to ocean resources. I've been trying to follow what's been going on with some of these multilateral fishing management organizations. And again, it's a very mixed bag. Some of them are not particularly effective, but I do think there's enough evidence of progress that that kind of thing will continue. They'll become more elaborated. You've had some interesting cooperation between different countries, coast guards and navies, when it comes to enforcing these, fishing rules. Um, again, the ISA itself, the International Seabed Authority, is going to be a great experiment in international governance. But I guess I would say I tend toward the optimistic view. But what does worry me, and here we could get into, talking about China and what China's claims are in the South China Sea.
Yeah.
There certainly is a strong appetite on the part of some countries to just say we get more ocean space in a kind of unilateral way. And that then could produce a really messy outcome where the whole edifice of the UN convention starts to kind of fall apart. And so what China's claims in the South China Sea are quite important, and in some ways are the most important challenge that we've had to the international rules since the adoption of the convention.
And like you said, not just because of the claims themselves, not just because of what they mean for Philippine rights or
Right.
Vietnamese territory, but because of what it does to that international governance structure and the precedent it sets for other distant rocky islands.
Yeah, and I mean, there's other countries out there, like Turkey has talked kind of ambiguously, but interestingly about, a blue homeland and, should we have special rights in the Aegean? Should we have special rights in the Black Sea? There are several Latin American countries that in the 1950s were very eager to claim 200-mile territorial seas. And if the framework were starting to fray around the edges, you could certainly imagine a bunch of countries saying, okay, we're just going to claim more. And then you could get back to that kind of period of legal chaos that we had in the 50s and 60s.
Well, you're right. There seem to be grounds for both optimism and pessimism. So hopefully good people are working on the former front.
Yeah, kind of depends on what your disposition is. Yeah.
Right.
What might save the international community in terms of China's claims is that China has been quite ambiguous about what exactly it's claiming in the South China Sea. Is it actually claiming an expanded exclusive economic zone, or is it a territorial sea? There's just lots of ambiguity there, and the way China has gone about it has been so aggressive that it hasn't made any friends for itself in the region, and so that may help in terms of preventing this from becoming a kind of precedent that others seize upon.
Right. Well, let me now reach into our chatterbox and find a random question for you. Don't be nervous. It's very unlikely to be painful. Recommend any recent book you've read or podcast you've listened to, TV show you've watched. What's something that's come across your attention recently that you think others would be interested in?
Well, during a summer trip, we were kind of driving from the West Coast back to the Midwest, and we passed through Little Bighorn. And I hadn't, read much about the battle there, but started to read a history of Custer, and so that's been kind of on my bookshelf for the last couple of weeks. It's been very interesting.
And something you hadn't really focused on before?
No, I had not focused on it before.
That's great. All new, right? It's just intellectual curiosity takes you there.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, David, thank you for being so generous with your time and for pulling together so many disparate ideas in history and governance so effectively for us here. I will point people, again, it's been a few years, but I want to point people back to your book, which covers all of these issues in more detail, The Poseidon Project, The Struggle to Govern the World's Oceans. David Bosco, thanks.
Thank you very much.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.